Nerdarchy for Nerds by Nerds. I am Nerder Doug, and tonight I am hanging out with this nerd.
Nerdarchist Ted, how are you doing this fine and lovely evening, sir?
Great, as always. This Monday was off to a great start as far as work and personal life and everything. So I am quite pleased with where I'm at this point in the day.
Awesome. As you can see from the title here, we're talking about firearms.
Right.
So I, of course, had on a shirt that had firearms.
your wit is knows no match.
I'm certain that there are people who are wittier than I. I'm certain if you talk to any of my friends, they will tell you that. But I do try, and that is the important part.
So I'm going to do my best to chime in and add to this discussion with you. This was an impromptu schedule change towards the last minute, so I was not prepared to discuss firearms. But I also like talking about D&D, and I can muddle through it, and I know that you can weave a conversation as well.
Absolutely. So if any of you out there have any questions or have anything that you would like to chime in as part of the conversation, please feel free to put it in the chat. As always, if you put Nerdarchy or question in front of it, we'll be able to notice that so much easier and be able to call out your question. So with firearms, as I was kind of discussing with Doug, I came a little prepared for this conversation. And it goes back to with second edition, we didn't really explore any of the extraneous features and what have you. So if there were books that went into guns and firearms and that kind of stuff, it was outside of anything that we looked at when because that's where I started playing when I was playing D&D with Dave in the beginning of our career of Nerdarchy. Going into third edition, there were many more books, that there were the open gaming license opened it to even more and more things. And the conversation of guns wound up coming up, and, it took D&D in a variety of different directions. And I just really wasn't into it. To me, that concept, bucked against that traditional fantasy. That was where I would go. I played a variety of other RPGs back in the day. Maybe not as many as Dave did. But if I played those and there were guns that were an option, sure, no big deal. But when it came to D&D, it was fantasy, and that's what I stuck to.
So with those other games, do you mean even ones that were also fantasy genre, or no?
I didn't play if I was going to do fantasy, there was no reason in my mind to not do D&D.
Yeah, you didn't you weren't into the crossover of firearms with fantasy in general.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. I played Shadowrun, I played Star Wars, maybe a couple of others prior to Nerdarchy, but there wasn't a huge amount. And if it had guns, fine. But I didn't do fantasy and guns. It just didn't make sense to me. But as my my gaming career moved on, as I got to do more and more things, the concept of changing that typical fantasy world into something different, to doing things that are not the norm, wound up becoming more and more interesting, more and more compelling. There was the Gunslinger that Matt Mercer had put out, and I looked at it and I'm like, okay, looks cool. I didn't immediately say I need to make one, but I didn't say like, oh no, not in my game, like that earlier thing. And then I eventually joined the group of people who love watching Critical Role, and while I'm now an episode behind, maybe two, now that they're actually streaming again, I watched all of Percy's antics, and it's like, all right, this is cool. And I've begun thinking about that kind of story arc and how interesting that would be to be a pioneer of bringing new technology. It doesn't necessarily have to be guns or firearms, but literally pioneering any kind of new technology would be a pretty cool character arc. And I think they did that really well. So I think it would be really interesting, and if somebody was coming to me to say, "Hey, I want to do that," in a D&D game nowadays, I'd be all for it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's sort of in a way like adjacent to science fiction, right? If you think about it, like a lot of science fiction is speculative in the sense of like, oh, sorry, my phone was buzzing. Okay, it's sort of like thinking, well, what if there was just life as we know it, except this one thing was more advanced, like whether it's communications technology or like jacking your brain into the matrix or whatever. It's like speculative. So firearms in a fantasy setting sort of open up the door to those sorts of themes too. It's just like, okay, well, what would the implications be? I mean, mechanically, even the examples in the DMG, which oddly enough, they do go back through several editions. I'm pretty sure the second edition DMG had a whole blurb in there, just like Chapter 9 does now, or it's not extensive, but it mentions it, right? Other kinds of weapons, I think, was probably in the first edition Dungeon Master Guide too, and probably the fourth. But mechanically, it's interesting because it's like, well, D&D is very what's the word I'm looking for? Abstract, when it comes to hit points and stuff. I mean, you think like, well, getting shot with a gun, that's pretty devastating. It's like, sure, so I was getting slashed in a sword. I mean, a lot of times we describe like any hit is like, yeah, you slash them from shoulder to waist or whatever, they're still fighting. And it's like, that would, that'd be pretty devastating. So, again, mechanically, like a pistol might do 1d6, piercing damage or 1d10 or whatever. So a lot of it, I was thinking about this in the time I had to consider it of sort of the same approach to when we discussed, and there's a post on the website about playing like vampire or werewolf. It's like the first thing I would wonder is, well, what do you want to get out of the experience? Do you just want to imagine that your character's like that? I mean, that's the most basic, easy way in that regard. It's like, just imagine your weapons are a gun instead. If you have a longbow, it's like, just say it's you can imagine it's a gun. It doesn't have any effect on the game mechanics, right? So you could start with there. That's pretty easy. And whether you want to be like the lone person in the world with it, which opens up tons of role-playing opportunities because people are like, what is that?
And it might get tiresome of like, oh, I've got to keep this away. This is dangerous, or this is something that I can't let fall into the wrong hands.
Right. But which was kind of like the Percy's arc, right?
Yeah. And that kind of stuff, can be fun and interesting. And it did, wind up affecting some things with campaign too, when they've encountered things. And I love things that hold over from one game to the next, so that the actions mean something to the world's history. And if you've got players who are into that, that's awesome.
One thing I had thought about too was, well, like a lot of things in any kind of level-based system, I suppose, which D&D obviously is one. There's that balance of believability in higher levels. So at some point you think like, well, you're going to have like a magic gun, right? Because like even a regular sword can't like pierce a dragon's hide or whatever. So a regular gun wouldn't either, And even the Critical Role got into that where like, they were infusing, I think Percy's gun also did like necrotic damage and things like that, which is really cool too, to think like you have this arcane, contraption. So that's another route to think about with firearms is the scalability, or you could just keep them where they are a devastating thing to lower level, things, but against like demons and celestials and Tarrasque and stuff. It's like, well, it's just bounce right. Or you could get like adamantine bullets. It could be like quest items and things.
Well, you mean you've also got the idea of infusing the weapon, that as opposed to literally just firing a projectile, but firing energy itself.
Yeah, laser guns.
Once you get into that avenue, then you're talking about well, is it a magic item, or is it just this conduit?
I mean, a wand of magic missiles could easily just be like a laser blaster,
right?
Or like a stun beam, so like or a phaser.
you can take all of those things and just kind of extrapolate it. There was a comment of Joe's like, oh, I've got a gunslinger, but he uses a wand, so it's a wand slinger.
Yeah.
And the damage that those starting firearms do, they're not any different than any other things. And I would love the idea of this arcana trained character who's got an array of wands at his side, and you could totally do the whole Western mentality of like, I'm gonna move my robe aside, and there's my holster of wands. It'd be like, oh, this is awesome, this is cool, and it doesn't change the mechanics at all.
Yeah, and it's fun that you bring up like those sort of gunslinger themes and images, and that's part of the fun of just doing these chats and just talking about D&D is just like wherever your imagination goes, you can kind of follow that. So Firearms, like you said, makes think of like the old West gunslingers duels, and we did a whole video on this like spell duels and things, and it's like, well, that could be a lot of very evocative for a campaign setting or an adventure or an arc or whatever. It's just like that sort of theme, where it's like, and a lot of our D&D games, that is the assumption, right? It's like you're in a frontier area, it's dangerous outside of town, like there's probably just a small community of like commoners that farm and have trading posts and stuff. So I mean, look into those things, you can just get a lot of inspiration for just your games in general, and then you start adding in like you said, like firearms or other kind of duelists, or it's just cool to think, to your point earlier about like being sort of opposed to that, like guns in your fantasy. Now it becomes something cool, right? Like imagine, an armored knight, and instead of like a sword, he's got like a pistol, right? That's pretty cool. Or like a long rifle.
Yeah. And those concepts of those frontier towns, how many D&D adventures start off in a little rickety village,
mm-hmm.
or a place out on the edges of civilization. So like you're already at that kind of level, so those kinds of things actually fit.
Yeah,
and
for a DM standpoint, I'm thinking a firearm specifically. Maybe you start your campaign like countless others in that small frontier town, and the firearms are introduced when the bandits who you have to defend the town against with, they have firearms, and that could be very compelling in a fantasy thing. Like, what are these things? Where do they come from? They just devastated people, at long range, and so that could be pretty interesting, to rogue players in and get them interested.
That would be a crazy start to a game,
yeah.
Especially if the players literally have no clue from the beginning,
right?
I think that could be a lot of fun to get to explore those kind of concepts. Kind of loosely related to that, when we look at our campaign setting, Chimes of Discordia, we look at this is a world that has gone through numerous ages, that the gods and greater beings look at the world, and every time things kind of get out of hand or things get too powerful, they step in and shunt everything that's a problem out of the way, and vast amounts of demi-planes all over the place, and things continue for those people, but the world winds up having to like reset,
right?
Because it's oh crap, the world got to this, and we've got areas where dragons were fighting giant mech robots. So like I imagine that there were lasers and guns of all kinds of sorts, and books detailing this are probably exist in some way, shape, or form somewhere.
You mean like fifth edition, like third party stuff?
Well, no, like in the world itself.
Like it got missed in the reset.
So yeah, I mean, there's got to be areas where this stuff is able to be found, because gods, as much as they say they are, they're not perfect. They're gonna miss things. Areas where it's hidden from view or magic.
We had talked before going live too of just like those old like console role-playing games like Final Fantasy-esque or Dragon Warrior or whatever, and a lot of those games were clearly fantasy settings, swords and sorcery, but at some point in the game, whether it was towards the end or whatever, you'd be down deep in a dungeon and there'd be like a computer or like an inert robot, right? And it's like, so it evokes the same sort of feeling or things that are incorporated into D&D itself, that like the world is built on this other civilization from long ago. I mean, the Shannara books are just like that too, or Numenera, where that's sort of just like flipping the perspective, but the same thing. It's just like it's far in the future, so the past is buried and unknown and mysterious. And so that's another way to work firearms then, where they're just a holdover from thousands, millions of years ago or whatever. I thought I saw a couple of questions. Oh, boy, there's actually several in the chat. So
okay, so what kind of questions? What kind of variations do you use for firearms?
Yeah, I got one from Joe's site. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so what kind of variations do you use for firearms? I mean, there's a list in the DMG, that has a a pretty good use.
Yeah, I'm looking right at it right now. It's got laser pistols, antimatter rifles.
And if you were to if you were to incorporate them into like an iron golem, you basically have created a mech. You've got this giant thing. You could even put it to a next size category up, and mount kobolds, goblins, or a couple of humans as part of it. And they're operating turrets off of the thing's shoulders or what have you. You could totally steal the thing from the Thor movie, that the basically the giant golem's eye rays could
the destroyer.
Nothing more than an antimatter rifle beam, ray of disintegration.
I mean, there's so many effects already in the game too. Like you just said, disintegration, like the spell. I mean, that's easily could just be like a disintegration ray, classic villain plot. They want to make their death ray or whatever, right?
Yeah, and
bombs, good dynamite. I mean, it all just comes down to flavor and mechanics, right? I mean, whether it's a antimatter rifle that shoots a beam that does 68 necrotic, or like enervation or whatever, it's like it's just having an effect on the game. So
you hit the nail on the head.
Oh,
good. You hit the nail on the head. Literally taking any spell and saying, I'm going to incorporate this into a weapon, like a gun, a pistol, a rifle, what have you, a bazooka. It's all, the mechanics are already there. They tell you whether it's a DC or whether it's whether it's an attack roll. You just steal that, use it. They did the math for you. Just use it.
Yeah. I've certainly been inspired by many a third-party product that is their take on whether it's sci-fi or just firearms in regular D&D, or it's part of the setting or whatever. That there's a lot of neat ideas out there for different things and different sorts of armor. So as far as like what variations, just the stuff in the DMG, whatever comes up, things that I find in books that I think are cool. What was the other question?
So Joe also said, what about artillery? So I'm guessing, are you talking about beyond a
like a Gatling gun?
If you start going into cannon and trebuchet and that kind of stuff, that's where you're seriously hauling out the rocket launcher and the nukes and that kind of stuff, that are like, all right, we're talking about serious damage.
Right.
Again, you could replicate.
Yeah, that's like structural damage. But even like like you said, bazookas or mortars or like a Gatling gun. I mean, it's like a Gatling gun. It'd just be like a cone that they have to make a save, or they take blah 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 piercing damage, right?
Gatling gun. Are you talking about serious high power stuff? Or are we talking low? Like, okay, if you're talking about low power, well, maybe it's just the equivalent of like a fire breath spell, or if you're talking about a serious thing, then cone of cold, but make it bludgeoning damage or what have you.
Yeah, see, the beauty of it is the fantasy setting, if you ask me, and I suspect you probably would agree with this too, because like there's a few comments about, what about firearms without powder, or like they run out of ammo and stuff, and it's like, look, that's if you want to get that noodly in your game, you could totally do that, but I don't make players track arrows either, so it's like that's just not fun for me, and it's probably not fun for them, and I suppose going by the firearms guidelines in the GMG, that's kind of neat because on average they do a little more, and maybe they have like 5 shots before they have to be reloaded. So that can be kind of a fun trade-off, for that player. It's like, okay, well, you're going to do a little better, but every 5 shots you have to stop and reload or whatever. And maybe that'll make for dramatic situations where you're like, oh man, I don't have any bullets, or like they.
And I think that trade-off. I think that trade-off can be fun.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to do more damage on average than your typical long sword or long bow, great. You've got the ability to do that, but action economy is going to come into it. You're going to have those moments of, well, what happens if you run out of ammunition? I'm like yourself. I hate tracking that stuff.
Yeah.
If you say I have a longbow, I have arrows, and if there is not cause for me to not have more arrows, okay, it's important to the story, great, let's move on with it. Just like, what happens if somebody steals the fighter's sword? Okay, yeah. Same basic shit. But
right.
if it's so stupid to have to worry about that nitty-gritty. These days I don't play with encumbrance, I don't track ammunition, I don't care. It's not a fun element to the game. I'm not saying that if you do that you're wrong. I'm not going down that road. You play the game how your group enjoys.
You just focus on different things. Hey, a lot of our perspective on games and gaming, I believe, is probably due to like playing much shorter sessions and playing a lot of online streaming or just online with people in general. Where it's like, look, that stuff's, it does seem fun if you had like a long campaign with your friends that went on for years and it was like super realistic. But it's like, look, the reality is I'm playing for like 2 or 3 hours tops. This might not even continue for another campaign. So it's like, that's just not fun. I want to have a cool story and do the fun action stuff. And, like running out of bullets in a one shot, it's like, well, that doesn't make a compelling fun story for me because it's like, you're probably not going to revisit that later where they're going to get bullets, or it's like, you're just out of them for the rest of the adventure. So it's kind of a drag.
So, I mean, Joe hit the nail back in second edition. It was a cool factor. Now it takes away from the fun.
Yeah. It just depends on how you play. I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say I was at least a little envious of, like, I'm sure you've seen, photos of people, like, their basement has, like, an entire city made out of Dwarven Forge that they adventure in every week for, like, the last 20 years. And, that's awesome, man. I would love to be able to experience something like that. Right? Like, no, I'm sure if you guys had Griffin Gaff, like, built on your table down there, that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, that would be fantastic to be able to, have had that. But I mean, that's not anything that we've done.
Right.
Our history is rife with campaigns that fell apart.
Mm-hmm.
Whether people have left the group, whether DM has burnout from running week after week after week, or whether it's a scenario of, well, you know what, I need a break, or the DM, the other person DMing says, I've got this great idea, and okay, everybody's in for it. So now you go and do something else, and that story, peters out.
Yeah.
I've got fantastic characters that I would love to pick up again, but those DMs are gone, or those campaigns are lost to the ages.
Mm-hmm.
And I've told most of those stories time and time again on the chat, so no need to go back into them.
One of the comments made me think of my own campaign. Joe Savage said he's been designing a gun without powder, like a pepper box with a different type of barrel. And there is an NPC in my Spelljammer campaign that they never found named Pepperbox. It was like a Warforged sort of inert thing that was, I imagined as sort of like an antique gun, aesthetically, created robot type thing. That was all just a little anecdote. That name reminded me because I thought that was a cool name for a Warforged antique, gun toting robot thing. I would love to play a good second edition game again. There's a question that was. Would having a gun and using spells as ammunition, like a thorn whip ammo, would that work as a new class? I mean,
I don't think thorn whip would be a good delivery.
I don't know. It'd be kind of like a grapple gun, right? It like shoots it out like a like. I don't know. You know, it's interesting. A new class, a new subclass. I mean, it's just Strail's line. Like, it's fun to make subclasses for sure. I mean, we love doing it. Obviously, here we do it a lot. But at the same time, I mean, you could, like we said earlier, you could just imagine that that is what you are doing. You know, whether you have a wand or a wand. Maybe your spell focus is a wand that's shaped like a pistol, and that's what you cast your spells through. And it looks like Thorn Whip's shooting out of that, or your Eldritch Blast, or whatever. You know. And I totally get it. I guess the question is, like, when it comes to firearms or any of these things, do you want to just imagine that's what your character is doing, or like I said earlier, what are you looking to get out of the experience? Like, what do you imagine would be different about doing that would require a class, right? Like, if you were channeling your spells through a focus, that's pretty much what you're doing anyway when you're spell casting. And I'm not trying to like poo-poo that idea. I'm saying like that's how I would approach it. It's like what would be different about that?
So I mean, looking at anything that would be an attack cantrip, legitimately could very well be, the type of damage or the type of release that a firearm could do. I wasn't even thinking about grapple gun, but that definitely makes sense. But whether you go with Firebolt, Eldritch Blast, Ray of Frost, all of those.
Even Fireball, right? You got like a thermonuclear shell.
Well, I mean, you go to Fireball, or you go to like the rocket launcher that's a one-use meteor storm. I mean,
yeah, right.
That could legitimately be a thing. And whether you talk about making it a magic item or whether you talk about, like, I think that fits better as a magic item than it does, a legitimate subclass.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, it's just got me thinking about all the different things that you could layer into a gun. And, you could have, what if my gun did this? And then you had enhancements to where you could add on, these cantrips on top of that.
Oh yeah, right.
My brain is now a whirl of ideas, and trying to speak and get my brain to stop going in a certain direction is a little bit hard.
Sure. And that's like, and that, that's another example of using like what we already have to sort of, make your imagination come to life. So like, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, it's not uncommon in a lot of sci-fi action or RPG games to have like certain kinds of ammunition, right? Like, oh, when you level up, like one of your options is maybe you can have like, incendiary bullets, right? So, to your point, it's like, well, maybe that's a thing to explore where, you have basically a mundane, a hand crossbow, let's say, but you can, deliver your spells through that, right? Like that might be something to consider. So maybe that subclass is all about like extending the range of spells because you're like attaching them to this projectile that you're then, firing at things. That can be pretty neat. So, and that's, I would probably look at like, how they word familiars and things like that as far as like delivering your spells through them. That could be pretty cool. Or Arcane Archer would be another. I mean, how easy is that to reflavor that as like the Wanted movie style, where you're like spinning the gun to make it go like a bullet around the corner or whatever. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just, you can use a lot of stuff that's there too.
I think Arcane Archer would be a fabulous reflavoring to do a lot of that kind of stuff, because you're already talking about being a spellcaster, and you're doing projectile stuff. So
yeah,
I think there's your easy go-to.
Mm-hmm.
But not to say that we don't make something in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, believe yeah, we were just talking today about how we have a large vault of ideas and design things on hand.
Well, I mean, how many different subclasses were we talking about today?
Yeah.
Teaser. We're getting close to fulfillment on out of the box,
Mm-hmm.
and shortly thereafter, we're planning to launch our second Kickstarter. So, we're already at work. Working on what the next thing is, and no, we're not going to tell you what it is, so don't ask.
I was gonna say. Oh yeah, so we've kind of like stayed on point here for half the chat now, so I think it's only fair that we deviate a little bit. So to ask you, have you seen the physical book yet? Did Dave bring one over?
I did, and I'm gonna jump off camera for just a second.
Yeah, so while he gets that, yeah, we have the final proof that they sent. That was the one to be like, okay, you okay this, and it'll start the presses. So we have done that. And I'm super excited. I haven't seen one yet, but yeah, it looks like it's a pretty thick book. I like that.
So, I mean, we are looking at, a good solid 195 pages. It's so many, so much cool stuff, flipping through and seeing this, that, there was so much work put into this, prior to Kickstarter and then after the Kickstarter. I love the new book smell. So I've sat here and flipped through a couple of times, and I look at this artwork that some of which was right from the Kickstarter page. To see in a physical book that's in my hands, and
that's nice glossy paper too, huh?
Yeah. And then as giddy and stupid as it is, I look at that that first page with writing on it, and it's got publisher and lead designer and writer, and then additional writing and design, and to see my name in the D&D book, it's like, wow.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's cool.
I'm such the nerd that it's like, yep, it's got Nerdarchy right there on the cover, and so it's awesome. I couldn't be more happy.
The other interesting thing I was thinking as you were looking about that. About firearms too, and specifically about like any kind of like class or subclass, is like one of the things I always look at when I, whether it's our own stuff or other third party stuff or homebrew, is like, well, a lot of people, very often I see a model where it's all the features are like, make me better in combat, right? Like which is cool. I mean, if people play, if that's a super important part of your game, then that's probably a crucial part of your subclass design. But I think it's interesting to think about like what else a firearms expert would bring to the table in terms of class or subclass design structure, and it makes me think like, well, they'd probably be smart in some way. I mean, if you want to maintain and modify and clean your gun and discipline and stuff, so it makes sense. Like the Matt Mercer gunslinger is a fighter, right?
Yeah.
So, but I'm curious, like, what other things might that engender? Like, what else would a firearms expert likely be good at outside of shooting them in combat?
Well, that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about the arc that Percy had, is like their primary spellcaster was a bard, so not very intelligent. Their intelligent person was the fighter.
Yeah.
And like that to me made Vox Machina quite the diverse element of a D&D game to watch. We look at those bastards, and the most intelligent person in the party is your character, the barbarian. So again, we have an element where the arcane caster is an idiot. And that's myself, so I can say that. So when I look at these things, it's like, all right, that is cool. So Percy was intelligent, he was a tinkerer, he was a nerd, just to to a great extent. So when you look at somebody who's going to do this, yes, most of the time you see the heroic warrior with this firearm, and it's the action hero. He's good looking, he's strong, he's willing to do this, but it's never presented in that Percy-esque fashion with the glasses and the extra, lenses on them to see, into this tiny thing. And, he didn't present as this, hulking brute and I am strong and I am mighty.
I don't even think he wore armor or anything. He just had like, rings of protection and stuff like that.
I don't remember all of the artwork that I've seen. Like he's just in this long fighting coat. So that's what's there, and those things are fun and interesting, and to play that different take on it is just really fun and interesting.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate fighters. We had talked about this earlier today in a meeting. For the mere fact that's like they're just awesome at fighting, so you really have a lot of flexibility in terms of your ability scores and skills and other things not related to fighting. That like they're pretty versatile in terms of all that other stuff. Like if you want to be a really smart fighter that's like has proficiency in history and stuff like that, I mean you're still going to be awesome at fighting, right?
and this is getting off topic, which is okay. We're past the halfway mark, and it's one of the things that I love about the design of 5th edition is your background allows you to have skills that in no way, shape, or form have to relate to your class.
Yeah.
And like looking at Pathfinder 2nd edition, if you want to be, highly spec'd out for your class, you need to choose a background that matches up with your prime stat. And 5th edition was like, no, we're not doing that nonsense. We're not going in that direction. So I think Pathfinder tried to emulate 5th edition, but did so in a very poor way. To each their own, but like I can make a spec'd out character that then has, skills or proficiency in skills that aren't supremely attached to my dude to make me more interesting.
Yeah.
We started a new game Saturday. Dave's started.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of fun.
So we're playing in the area of the dragon emperors of our world. So everybody basically had to be some kind of scaled thing.
Mm-hmm.
Reptilian or amphibian was the selection. And of course, somebody had to be different and decide, I'm just going to be human. So he was basically my real life sister, Dave's wife. It is her character's pet human. So it's pretty amusing. And, he's the one that's got all of the languages and the spells and is our, healer to some extent. So it's a lot of fun. But I wound up making a lizard folk artificer.
Yeah, that's a great concept. I like that a lot.
I took the aspect of lizard folk who works with leather and bone and, that kind of stuff and said, can I not get into working with metal? I want to work with just that stuff. So Dave was like, yeah, absolutely. So I wound up, I wasn't even thinking about going in this direction, but I wound up going with the battlesmith. So my creature is like this 6-legged, bone, wood, and leather giant lizard that walks around near me. I've got my, because it's medium armor, I've got scaled armor, but then I've got this mantle of leather and scrimshaw bone work that I wear. And because I've got that 8 charisma, I'm like, well, how crazy is this guy gonna be? How off-putting is he? Well, I've got something that doesn't make me smell like the dead because of, the artifice things that he can do. So I'm like, I always smell like a campsite, or a campfire. All right, well, that's not off-putting to, most people. Most people like that smell, or at least I do. So what else could I do? I'm like, all right, he's not gonna use the word I. It's always Skeggs. Skeggs will do this, or Skeggs thinks you should do this. He's a little weird, off-putting in that regards.
Sure.
But he's got these these fun elements to work with. But to take that deviation and going by what you said, if you've got tool proficiencies, you've got to make it be part of the game.
Yeah.
So that's what he does. We kill something that has bones that's not super sentient. All right, I'm gonna cut it open. I want to learn about it. I'm gonna, extract the most interesting looking bone pieces. So he likes, knuckles and wrists, things that are in the joints, not these long bone pieces that can't do much with. So like he's got this bag full of just bone nodules.
Yeah, that's a really neat take on that combination of things. Because yeah, he said like lizard folk. I mean that's sort of their jam, right? Of like using all the parts of things and making use of things. So I just remembered while you're talking, like part of the reason we chose firearms for the topic was based on the recent Unearthed Canada because it had Gunner in there, and to a lesser extent like the what do you call it, Bilgewater thing that was on D&D Beyond. I forget what it was called.
The crossover with League of
Legends. Yeah. And in those regards, it's like, well, those add a lot to those. As much as like those sort of genres can be, incorporate the fantasy elements to make them more in line with that. It also adds a lot to it with like cannons and pistols of pirates on the high seas and stuff like that. And and folded into that is also, I was thinking the idea of like, well, in these high magic settings, it's like, say you're like Forgotten Realms, or there's magic all over the place, right? It's not uncommon. Right. Guns might be part of the narrative of your world because, well, that's a way for non-magical people to, sort of even the playing field a little bit, right? Of like, well, they have long range spells that can hit us from, like 200 yards away and stuff. So there's a lot you can extrapolate from, whenever you mash genres together and learn, from them. Like we said,
I hadn't even considered of like, what would the common man do if magic is that common, to others.
Maybe it's scary to live in a world like if you're just a commoner on a frontier village and just thinking, not only is there monsters all over the place outside of here, which would make firearms appealing to them, because it's like, well, it's a lot easier to shoot something than get in a sword battle with a specter or a zombie horde or whatever. So yeah, those are great places to introduce those things.
So we're closing on our last 15 minutes. If anybody out there have any questions, feel free to put them out there. We got a couple of games coming up this week. Apologize for last week, but there were some personal issues that happened with some of the players. We got Those Bastards tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We got the Chaos Crew returning on Friday for the monthly game. There was a hiccup with the last month's game, so we're just gonna continue from here. We got a few more.
That's awesome. I didn't know that this is Friday.
Yeah, that is this one. So be on the lookout for that. I don't know if Daubers is going to be, that's.
I believe so. I believe so. That's Thursday at what, 4:30? Yeah, they're planning to game this week. I'm sure.
And then myself, I'm still on the Mini Terrain Domain game for the Dawnbringers. If you want to follow me over to Mini Terrain Domain, that's Thursday at 8:30 Eastern Time. So lots of games coming up for me this week.
Yeah, really. You have a nice mix of playing and DMing, a nice balance there, right? I mean,
I played last week, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
Yeah. Right. Oh, yeah. I didn't mean equal. It's like, I think, playing in more games than DMing is probably a nice balance for me.
Yes.
DM a couple of, I'm looking forward to Those Bastards. I really like that game. I'm also doing the fan game this coming Sunday, the monthly one shot, which I need a couple players. So if you want to email just Doug at nerdarchy.com if you would like to play D&D one shot for 2 to 3 hours this Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Hit me up.
Yeah, it's a great way to get in on a game. And we've recently begun changing what that game is. You actually get an exposure to what we're doing with our Patreon awards, so you get to see that before it's even published, before it's even put out there. So
And that's been working pretty cool for us. It's a chance to like play test stuff a little bit and give people a sneak peek. And honestly, I mean, yeah, I think it has helped make those monthly rewards and our products like a lot better. We're getting pretty, our work flows smoothing out each week, and I think we're really knocking out of the park. The Winter Lord's Throne is the next upcoming ones. Those get posted on the 5th of every month, in case anybody doesn't know. So yeah, usually this is our Patreon only chat, but during the pandemic here, we just opened it up to live so you could all hang out. But as part of the,
go ahead. So if you want to get access to them, patreon.com/nerdarchy. You sign up for the $2 reward or higher, and you will get access to those. You got to do it. Well, you don't have to do it, because if you sign up after the 5th, you would still get access. And we don't take down the old rewards, so technically you could just come in and grab a whole bunch all at once.
Yeah. Which I'm glad we started doing that. Kind of, it's a lot easier. You, especially probably for you, used to be the one that had to mail all those out.
I did. We would upload it to Dropbox, and I'd mail out. And I mean, before it used to be 4 or 5 different tiers of physical rewards.
Yeah.
So like I would have to make a separate folder for each one. Put the things in there for that month.
See how much love we have for our patrons. We used to have all these tiers on. It's just like, you know what? Give us a couple bucks. You get the whole thing, full color. And also, if anybody here is one of our Patreon supporters, we have a poll over on the Patreon page. We're trying to gauge interest in something that we were looking into doing. So if you want to go over there and vote in that would be tremendously helpful, because I think it'd be pretty cool to start doing that. It was cost effective.
Well, let's just throw it out there. Let's slam those barn doors wide open. There are other groups out there that are doing a physical mailed reward of what's possible digital, and we want your feedback to know whether, if you are used to getting our digital rewards, we've begun doing some research to find out what it would cost to get them printed up and mailed directly to you. So if that's something you are inclined to do, and you are a patron, please, head over there, check out that poll, and vote to let us know how worthwhile it would be to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been a really exciting year overall. So it's cool seeing some familiar names that have just been with us for so long here in the chat, and also new people too. And despite all the stuff that's going on, I think I'm more excited than ever about how we're moving. I mean, like you said, you got that physical book now. I mean, that's just so cool. Like nerd out moment, if nothing else. I mean, I'm sure being a little kid standing, in Walden Books looking at the things, you probably once or twice thought like, oh man, that'd be so cool to get to create something like this, and we did.
There was never, like, when I was, a teenager, maybe even early 20s, the concept of a published D&D book that I was a part of was nowhere near my mind. Like I, made up adventures and I did stuff, but like the thought of writing things down and, having it recorded and published and whatnot, I never thought, enough of myself for that to be a thing. 10 years ago, I'm, in a couple of weeks, I'll be 42. So even 10 years ago in my 30s, it was not something that I would have thought possible. Yeah. Like, 5th edition wasn't out. We were moving away from, fantasy RPGs as we played other games because 4th edition really wasn't doing it for us. It was just like, no, my name in a D&D book. No, that was not a thought that ever crossed my mind. And, here we are, 6+ years into Nerdarchy. You and Dave working the business full time, our first physical book getting ready to ship.
Mm-hmm.
All of these companies that enjoy hearing what we've got to say. Mm-hmm. All of these awesome fans turning in to watch our stuff and to care about our opinions and weigh in on different things. It's just amazing. You go out to cons and you see these people that are excited to have a conversation with you, and it's been an amazing ride, and I can't wait for things to get back to normal so that we can continue down that train and see people again. And
yeah, especially at Nerdarchy, the convention, right? Part of the biggest kick I get out of all this is like, when we have to have like serious meetings about like wizards and that still cracks me up.
Well, I mean, we had our Kickstarter meeting for project number 2 earlier today. We've got our weekly meeting tomorrow. We have filming on Wednesday. It's it's like one thing after another. So
yeah, it's an exciting life. I was just anecdotally, I was explaining to my girlfriend today how a lot of us nerds, we were talking about reading, like what we've been reading recently, and I was like, oh, this rule book and that rule book, and it sounds dorky, but I mean, a lot of us, we like to read these rule books, but it is sort of like a story. I realized, and when you're thinking about whether it's, I don't know, like the mechanics of another game or a new subclass, it sort of like inspires your imagination to think like, well, what would that be like, in game, right? Like in the moment.
Right.
So it sort of prompts you to imagine your own sorts of stories as you're reading the things, like I enjoy like the examples or just imagining playing the game and being like, yeah, I want to do that. I want my character to use that feature, or I want to imagine my D&D guy has a 6-shooter. Oh yeah, one thing I wanted to mention since we're getting close, especially specifically related to firearms, is and that idea that like they're from the past and all that. One of my favorite just pop culture characters is Buck Rogers. And part of what made him so accomplished in the future when he woke up, because originally I believe he was like it was like a late 1800s cavalryman or something, not an astronaut. He's sort of like evolved over the years to sort of like catch up to the times. So when he woke up in the far future, he had this 6-shooter Colt. And it's like that was what made him more powerful, because like, well, all their weapons and armor were designed to repel like laser blasts and stuff, and it was just like, this is just firing lead slugs. So it was like, kind of that same heroic like pulp quality. That's just a gun-toting guy in the future. And I always thought that was a cool aspect of that character. So in D&D could have that same effect too, where maybe if you don't have them as part of your world, like a player just really wants that concept, then make that their backstory. Maybe maybe they're from the past, right? I mean, it doesn't have to, that's a awesome potential storytelling stuff, right? Like if a character just woke up in the present, whether they're a Warforged or they were like cryogenically, frozen, or some stasis spell or whatever.
Yeah, I was going to say stasis spell.
Yeah,
there's loads of different ways of
of
looking at that. I was never a Buck Rogers fan. Was never anything that that grabbed me.
Yeah, sure.
It actually took a couple times of me watching Star Trek before I became a full-on Trekkie.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We talked about that the other day. Like, as oftentimes you bounce off things when you first watch it. And I didn't like Game of Thrones at first. And we talked about The Expanse. You're like, yeah, it really didn't grab you. Sometimes you give them another chance, and you might find it like, yeah. But Brian Smith mentioned Solomon Kane. Ty Johnson is a huge fan of that pulp hero. I believe his character from our Ether Skies campaign was sort of, inspired by that, with the rapier and a pistol vibe. Yeah, awesome. I mean, that's iconic, right? The Shadow, like that pulp hero sort of blends firearms and magic, where he like clouds your mind.
Sorry, I can't hear the Shadow and not immediately go to the gamers.
Yeah, I've never seen that, so
it is quite comical. But every time, like the Shadow is like the villain of the campaign.
Dark Lord.
Every time his name is said, it's like the Shadow.
Yeah.
The Shadow. It's like it just echoes as everybody has to repeat it.
Like Ukatoa.
Yeah. So it's like quite comical, quite fun, and
I think we've all that's like a common thing that happens in game groups, right? Like whether it's like the Shadow or Ukuto. I can't think of anything specifically, but I'm pretty sure in campaigns I've played, there's been like just some entity that players like goof around repeating the name like that.
And it's it takes a certain type of person to really fall in love with this hobby that we have here, and we're it's there's a predilection towards oddballs in general to go down on this hobby, and therefore the chances of them being the goofy silly types every so often winds up being increased. So
and even if you have like a tense dramatic campaign or a horror story or whatever, those having a little lightheartedness actually enhances that. I mean, that's why horror movies have like the comic relief and stuff, because it's like,
well, I mean, any good story in general is going to have the ups and downs. You want those dramatic moments, you want that comedy, and it doesn't matter what elements of story you're or what theme you have for that story. Incorporating all those elements is going to make the story better.
Yeah.
So we're down to our last few minutes. Those people out there in the chat, if you got anything that you want to ask, now's that time. Doug, you got any final topics you want to get into?
Yeah, I was just gonna say. So today I was doing the post about Druid magic items. Because we always have like a post that's sort of related to the videos over on the channel, and I usually go to the D&D homebrew stuff to look, for stuff, because we usually look at the official magic items or whatever subclasses for those sorts of videos, and there was some pretty cool stuff that I thought for druids. There was a bow called Dryad's Gift. And I don't normally imagine a druid with a bow, but it's not impossible. But you could just and it wasn't super powerful, but you could just, if you drew like any branch through like an arrow, would transform it into an arrow, and then when it landed, or if it was like if you hit somebody, or it turns back into a branch when it strikes something. So I was thinking, like, that's pretty cool for a druid, because it's like, well, you're conserving, and maybe you shoot it into a tree, and it's like, oh, now it just becomes a branch growing out of that tree and stuff. But there was some pretty cool magic items themed for druid. My favorite, though, had to be this one that, excuse the fine with my voice, I'm going to call Bear Stick, because it was like in all caps, and it was Bear Stick. And it was just a stick that could summon a bear once a day. And it was like, it wasn't charmed by you or anything. But I was like, druids are pretty powerful, and they can do a lot of different things. And that one really captured my attention and imagination, being all in caps like that. So I was like, yeah, that's a go-to. Oh, because I broke it down by item type. That was a one, right? And I was like, sure. Just bear.
My level of botany is not super high. But when you're like, oh, I could, draw an arrow on this branch, fire it at a tree, and then have that branch essentially reform to that tree, that to me was like, oh, well, what kind of crossbreed trees could you make?
Oh, yeah.
Like a pine and an oak, like what would that make? What kind of seeds would come off of that? So like my brain is now looking at, this weird forest that's been made of these crossbreed trees because of this archers decided to have.
That's a sign of a creative player, whether you're a DM or a player. Just thinking of things like that, like how does this mechanical or magical, effect in the game, like just basically putting yourself in the shoes, right? Like looking beyond like the numbers on the page, like what would that do? Like what would, what would that look like if I saw it in person? That's such a tremendous aid to, role playing, I guess. For me,
I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at Michael's concept.
A gun that fires bears. Yeah.
A gun that fires bears.
That's the beauty of these imaginative games. Say you've got like summon woodland creatures. You could just say if your arcane or your druidic spell focus is a gun-shaped piece of mistletoe or whatever, who's to say you're not just aiming it like bear, 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 and they're just like coming out a little beam and then like whoop 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 whoop. Like, why not, right? It doesn't change any like the effect of the spell, right? There's bears and they're under command, so why not? Sure.
I don't.
I mean, it's no weirder than just like appearing out of nowhere.
Anyway. I think Bear might be pretty high on the scale for getting multiple, but you know, I mean, you know, guns have a sound, so woof, woof, woof.
Yeah, yeah, all the wolves for sure. Man, I remember the first time a player cast that. It was like, you know, it was a pretty cool encounter. It was the first round, but they were further down the initiative list, and I was like, okay, you know, like seems like a pretty even match. And he's like, I'm gonna summon, you know, like 12 wolves, and we're just like, and like kill this thing, and like immediately I'm like, oh, okay. A grizzly grenade launch. There you go.
So I mean, you could really.
Smith. Yeah, like we said, the draw is, you know, they're a way for non-magical people to even the playing field. They're a sort of speculative sci-fi element of like, well, what is the world like except it's just got this one little thing that's different. What are the implications of it, storytelling wise, and that sort of thing.
So, you know, part of the thing is, you know, long bows require a lot of effort to not hurt yourself, to perfect. You know, it's shot. Yeah. Archery is not super easy. I'm not a fair shot with a longbow, but I've put a lot of time in at a range as a child. I grew up with the Scouts. That was just, you know, kind of one of those things you did.
Sure.
Crossbows, infinitely easier to get that same kind of punch, if not bigger, and, you know, was significantly easier to train. When you go from crossbow into an actual firearm, it gets even easier. You know, the biggest thing is dealing with any kind of recoil.
Yeah.
You know, I'm no crack shot or any of that kind of stuff, but, you know, I was pretty fair at a range in the times that I've actually gone shooting. So therefore, you know, to the layman, to the common person, it is easier to operate those kind of devices as technology makes these things better. Even if the damage is the same in your games between a longbow, a crossbow, and a rifle, it is significantly easier to look down a barrel and go,
yeah,
and, you know, fire.
And in the context of like comparing it to magic, I mean, you know, say like a cantrip is, yeah, presumably it's like a spell that you've practiced thousands of times so that you can cast it like, you know, just like stupefy, like Harry Potter style or whatever. Whereas like you could just be like, hey, turn this safety off, just point it and shoot. You know, it's like that's a lot easier, right, than learning becoming a wizard or whatever.
And so, you know, you have to, and then as far as, you know, other elements of the draw is we have to look at the iconic heroes or iconic characters, not even necessarily heroes,
yeah,
that are depicted, you know, with these guns. And, you know, we play RPGs to get into fantasy, to get into you know, a fictional character, not necessarily having to be fantasy, to step outside of ourselves and to have fun in this new setting, this, you know, this, and become this character. So if you have this heroic icon or this icon, you're like, oh man, that is awesome. I want to do that. I want to emulate that. Well, if you don't have access to firearms, well, then you're never going to do a Billy the Kid, even as a fantasy western, you know. But if you add that element, all right, now I've got this, you know, outlaw character who's got, you know, the spurs and the, you know, the pistol at his side and staring down the law. You know, you can do all that fun stuff. So why not?
Yep. So with that, yeah, we're a couple minutes over, but we had a lively discussion. I enjoyed talking about firearms and D&D, and Dave will be here tomorrow afternoon, like he is every weekday at noon Eastern, talking to creative pros and industry people about RPGs and whatever nerdy stuff comes up. And like Ted mentioned, we got a lot of games coming up too, and we'll be back next Monday, of course, to talk about another D&D ideas topical theme. And until next time,
stay nerdy.
Stay nerdy.